As you all know, there's an election coming up in 18 days, and voting is the most fundamental responsibility and privilege we enjoy in our democracy. This fall, a group of our students have launched a nonpartisan push called You Chai Votes to encourage voter turnout on campus. And so if you want to make sure that you're registered, find out early voting dates in any state, or find a nearby polling place, check out their website at youchaivotes.com. That's youchaivotes.com. You can also, for the first time this election, you can vote early on campus at the Reynolds Club. We have an early voting station that's going to be there from October 31st through November 2nd. And you know, whether you vote here in Chicago or vote by absentee ballot at home, vote. Vote. It's important. It's the sort of ante of a democracy. As for this event, as usual, we'll open the floor to take questions from the audience. There'll be a microphone in the aisle. And as usual, we'll give priority to the first three questions to our students. And also, as always, I'll give you the same admonition. A question is something that ends in a question mark. Let's try and observe that. I ask that you silence your cell phones. And now, where are you? There you are. Here to formally introduce our speaker is Holden Higgins. Holden is a first-year student from my hometown and Jonah's hometown of New York City. Holden is studying economics, and he's an active member. You just got here. How active can you be? He's an active member of the College Republicans here on campus. So please join me in welcoming Holden to the podium.
It is my pleasure today to introduce Jonah Goldberg and Mary Catherine Ham. Our guest is the author of 3 books: the New York Times #1 bestseller, Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Meaning, which I personally recommend to all of you who have not already read it. The Tyranny of Cliches, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas, and most recently another New York Times bestseller, The Suicide of the West. He's a columnist for the LA Times and National Review, where he's a senior editor, and holds the Asness Chair in Applied Liberty at the American Enterprise Institute, coincidentally named after a Chicago Booth alumni. He is also the host of a podcast in National Review called The Remnant. Today's conversation will be moderated by Mary Catherine Ham, a political commentator at CNN and a visiting Pritzker Fellow at the IOP this fall. Without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Mary Catherine Ham and Jonah Goldberg.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Briefly, I would say I think it's important in a political career to remain humble. And one of the great ways to do that is to have children. Just before I got here, preparing for this august event where I get to be front and center with my esteemed colleague, my child rolled by where I was teaching a seminar in her stroller, 5-year-old. I said, "How's it going? What you guys going to do?" And she goes, "Ta-ta, Mom, no time to chat." So I'm glad that you're here to listen to me chat, since no one else will at home. Jonah, I'm glad to be here with you. I think we find ourselves in a similar ideological, semi-politically homeless spot lately as I think, robust Trump critics, but right of center. As I say at CNN, that makes my hate mail extremely diverse. It's a good time. It would be easy to jump in straight with whatever Trump's thing is that he has done today to spin everyone up, but I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
Because I have been arguing that we should resist that temptation during my seminars here. So I will ask you this. This is a big book in an ideas sense, and I think many who come to it, many on the right who don't love that we are Trump critics, would think this is a response to Trump. Mm-hmm. That the title of the book, that the idea behind the book is a response to Trump. But this is a pre-Trump book project.
Yes.
Explain, in fact, it's sometimes 200, 300,000 years before Trump.
Yes.
Tell me about the origins of it.
Right. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. I know about the humbling experience of kids. One time when my wife was I was at the liquor store and had my then 2 or 3 year old daughter with her, and my daughter's looking around. She goes, "What is this place?" And my wife says, "It's the booze store." And my daughter yells, "Booze? My daddy loves booze!" Which meant that we never went back to that liquor store. So I started working on this book back when no one, including I think Donald Trump himself, thought he could be president of the United States. And it was a strange experience to work on it, because again, as you're right, it starts about 250,000, 300,000 years ago, when I think even Donald Trump would concede he was not a major presence on the political landscape. And
maybe.
But it was a fascinating experience to be living through the Troubles,
Right.
trying to work on a book and have all these changing views about evolutionary psychology and tribalism as it was sort of going on all around me. And I wrote this book in some ways, we heard the list of the previous books I did, to model something that I thought the conservative movement needed before Donald Trump rose up, which is that too much of the conservative movement now is about fan service, right? And that you have this enormous amount of, if you're in my line of work and maybe a little younger than me, you can have a pretty good living only talking to audiences that already agree with you and telling them things that they already believe. And I think this is a problem across the media landscape. It's a problem in a lot of other places. So one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to actually get back to something that is sort of more in my roots. I was a super nerdy fan of magazines like The Public Interest and Commentary as a kid, and I want to make arguments.
Right.
And so one of the things I try to do is I try to work on terms that should be appealing to people across the aisle from me. The progressives, whatever you want to call them, say that they care about science and evolution and facts and empiricism and they're pragmatists and blah, 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 blah. And so my argument is entirely grounded in that stuff rather than appeals to divine authority or all the rest, which has pissed off a lot of my friends on the religious right.
And in the modern environment, as I've been chatting with students this week, of course, Kanye came to mind, because when does he not? But
I'm here to bring the male energy today. So
what I was arguing is that, to me, one of the realizations that I hadn't fully grokked before the 2016 election is that I am such a weirdo, because I am ideological, because I spend a lot of time thinking about this, because I relish making these arguments. And the average American voter is more Kanye than Friedrich Hayek, right?
Sure.
And I don't even mean that. It's just a gut level, I think this guy's interesting, I think what he's saying can serve me, and that's how they make their decisions. In that type of environment, and I think you would probably argue that some of that is just innate to who we are, how do you make those arguments to American voters?
Yeah, it's tougher than it's ever been for a whole bunch of reasons, right? I mean, part of the problem is that people keep yelling at me as a National Review guy. Our historic role is sort of to be the policeman of the right, and we patrol the swamplands and decide who's expelling the Birchers and the Randians, but keeping everybody else, that kind of thing. And we still do a lot of that. The problem is that we're supposed to be gatekeepers, but the walls on either side of the gate have completely been knocked down. And it used to be in Bill Buckley's age that if he said you were crazy or racist or anti-Semitic or not acceptable, you weren't going to appear in National Review and you weren't going to get on any TV shows. And so they had to scurry off and do newsletters, mimeograph sheets that they did for direct mail and stuff. Now with the internet, it's profoundly democratizing for all kinds of voices. And at the same time, the elite institutions, in a market that is so segmented and balkanized, you have, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or frankly the New York Times, it doesn't matter, where everybody is trying to find, as appeal to a niche of a market segment, you end up telling your customers what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And then you add in things like Facebook, which I think is a force for evil in the world. You have people retreating in, and they are curating their information load that only confirms what they already believe.
Right.
And so it's very hard, you know. And and one of the things that kind of frustrates me in this moment when this book came out, I got a much better hearing from Morning Joe and The Daily Show and NPR, where admittedly I'm a bit of a Shabbos goy these days, than from Fox or right-wing talk radio, because I'm considered an apostate for the Trump stuff.
Briefly, so I'm a little torn on the media democratization, because I do think we look back with rose-colored glasses on a time when 2 national newspapers and 3 anchors ran everything. Just the number of voices that can encompass is very small. So I welcome and was very laissez-faire about social media on its rise. I am now somewhat less sanguine.
Yeah.
But that comes from the thing that you describe in the book as that you call the miracle, right? This is an outgrowth, this incredible creative energy. Will you tell us about the miracle and sort of how it plays in this book and what's at stake?
Sure. So, I mean, the basic setup of the book is that, of the argument, is that for 250,000 years, or whenever we split off from the Neanderthals, the average human being everywhere in the world lived on no more than $3 a day for 7,500 generations. Humanity's natural condition was grinding poverty, punctuated by an early death, usually from some bowel-stewing disease or from violence. And then once and only once did that change. And it's been changing ever since. We live right now in the greatest moment of poverty alleviation in all of human history, with hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty in Asia, in Africa. The UN may get rid of the designation of extreme poverty soon because it just may be wiped out. And it's because of these ideas that come out of what I call the miracle. The reason I call it the miracle is not an appeal to God. The first sentence of the book is that there is no God in this book. Spoiler alert, he kind of sneaks in at the end, but that's a different thing. It is because while there's a huge consensus about this poverty being the natural condition thing, there is no consensus about why it happened. Marxists have one story. Anti-colonialists have another story. The Max Weber groupies have another story. No one will really agree on it. But what happened was miraculous. We are hardwired to be bigots. People say, oh, you have to teach people to hate. No, you have to teach people not to hate, because we are born with a tribal us versus them mentality that is innate to the human psyche. And what happens out of this miracle is that for the first time, it sort of put into practice a lot of the best principles of Christianity and Judaism, but it created systems that deal with strangers in ways that was non-zero sum. And I don't call it the Enlightenment, because Steven Pinker has a wonderful book out, but he basically has this thing where he says, everything I don't like is not the Enlightenment, and everything I do like is the Enlightenment. And the reality is there were a bunch of different Enlightenments. I'm sort of like Mike Myers, and so I married an axe murderer. When it comes to Enlightenments, if it's not Scottish, it's crap. And it's probably a little too glib, but the French Enlightenment gave birth to all sorts of terrible things. The German Enlightenment had all sorts of problems. I call it the miracle because we can't explain it, but it was wonderful. And the problem, which, this miracle thing bothers a lot of people, but a big part of the argument in my book, where the suicide part comes from, is that I've become much more critical of capitalism. Capitalism depends on values and norms it cannot create and cannot restore once lost. And those norms come from civil society and institutions like the family, from organized religion, from a bunch of places. And so one of the problems that we have is because of things like Facebook and Twitter, and because of the erosion of civil society generally, people are retreating from civil society, they're going into their homes, and they are following politics as if it's a form of entertainment. And there's a thing that happens to your brain when you follow things as entertainment. When you go to a movie, if you like the hero, if you like Harrison Ford or Denzel Washington, he can torture people, he can murder people, and you're like, yeah, kill another one. Paul Bloom at Yale writes about these amazing tests where if you take someone into a laboratory and you show them someone in a controlled room being electroshocked, the empathetic parts of your brain will light up, because you do one of these like you would in a movie or something, because you kind of imagine it happening to you. But then if the observer is say a huge Chicago Bears fan, and you tell them that the person being shocked is a big Green Bay fan, the pleasure centers of their brain start lighting up.
To be fair, football is very important.
I understand that, but politics shouldn't be this important.
As an SEC alum.
And so when you start watching politics like it's a form of entertainment, you start internalizing this idea that politics is all about punishing the other tribe. And because we're nationalizing things, because people are retreating from the communities where they really live, we care more about what some jackwad is doing 1,000 miles away than what someone is doing in our own backyard. And we are abstracting out, that's where the tribalism really comes from, is we see, partisan identity is stronger than it's ever been in American life. Security. So partisan identity is stronger in American life, where now, for lots of people, their partisan identity is more important to them, more determinative of their values and their behaviors than race, religion, ethnicity. That is new and weird in our politics, and it's because people aren't getting proper sources of meaning close to home, and they're retreating to politics to find sources of meaning for them.
Given that tribalism is sort of, as you argue, and I think the studies show, is part of human nature.
Absolutely.
We did have this miracle moment where we had this consensus, at least in part of the world and part of society, that we were going to resist that temptation. We were going to make arguments. How is it that we do not just that we didn't revert for so long? Why is this the moment that we are moving in that direction?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think Ronald Reagan was right when he said we're never more than one generation away from tyranny, because we don't inherit liberty in our blood. It has to be fought for. My favorite version of this is from Hannah Arendt, who said, every generation Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And babies come into this world, I mean, you know this, babies come into this world, they're not blank slates. They have a lot of preloaded software, but they need updates. Mm-hmm. And that's what civil society does, that's what the family does. When you have things like the breakdown of family, recall the Life of Julia ad from the Obama campaign. Julia, in this fictional, creepy PowerPoint presentation, is this woman who basically has no relation to any institution other than the federal government. And every slide begins, under President Obama, Julia gets a Pell Grant and a loan. Under President Obama, one of the creepiest sentences ever was, under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. And this was a deracinated individual who had no obvious connections to civil society, no parents, no husband, no institutional relationships. It's only at the end of her life she gets to work in a community garden. And one of the reasons why Patrick Deneen and some other people have been writing books saying, blaming all of this on Locke. That it's a 500-year mistake, liberalism is bad, it's alienating, it's atomizing, and we need to go back to some sort of pre-liberal or post-liberal understanding of politics. I disagree with a lot of that, but their critique is right, that we live in this era where self-control is culturally frowned on and self-expression is celebrated at every turn. And 30 years ago, if you saw someone walking down the street with a neck tattoo, you'd walk to the other side of the street. Today, that person could be a poetry teacher at Bryn Mawr, right? I mean, we have this sort of neo-romantic idea that our highest source of moral authority is our own gut, that as long as you're true to yourself, you're a real person. Go with your instincts is something we teach kids from a very early age. Go with your instincts is a terrible thing to tell a child. I mean, that's what you tell children when you want them to eat, lead paint chips because they think they're potato chips, right? I mean, the whole point of parenting is to teach kids that their instincts could lead them in the wrong direction. But in our culture, on a mass scale, we celebrate these sort of romantic impulses, and that makes us angrier about politics and brimming with a sense of entitlement that the world is being unfair to us and that we're owed more.
I'm reminded just briefly of there was a big internet row about Mark Wahlberg's daily routine recently, because I'll enlighten you. He gets up at 2:30, he works out, he prays, he eats breakfast, he blocks off certain times for family, he works out again. It was all extremely industrious, And I thought quite admirable when I read the story. I was incorrect because his self-control was frowned upon, and it became a giant Twitter bash fest of Mark Wahlberg because he did these things, which I found bizarre because I'm oriented a different way. Part of what you talk about in the book is one of our issues is ingratitude, frankly, for this miracle that we have inherited, or ignorance of what it took to get here and how lucky we are to be here. But in this day and age in particular, but all times, ingratitude is a tough sell, right? You should be more grateful is a tough sell, especially when people have experienced hardships or historical oppression. How do we deal with that part of this?
Yeah, I mean, so part of the argument, I have at the end of the book an appendix, which is very much like the bulk of Steven Pinker's book, of just pointing out all of the material progress that we have made. If, 100 years ago, it was normal in American society to experience the death of a child. It's just normal. It happened to rich people, it happened to poor people, it happened to black people, it happened to white people. Calvin Coolidge, when he was president of the United States, his son was playing on the White House tennis courts, got a blister on his foot, it got infected, he died a week later. That was normal. Today, to lose a child is the same tragedy as it was 100 years ago, but it's all the more considered tragic because it's so rare. And we have no appreciation of that, just that kind of material improvements that we have had. But beyond that, my friend Yuval Levin, I keep dropping names of UChicago people, he got his PhD here. He's made the argument that conservatism, rightly understood, is gratitude.
Right.
That you look around and you say, you look around for the things that are lovable because they are lovely about your life, about your society. These are the things that you want to pass on to your children and your grandchildren, and you want to preserve them. If you are ungrateful about things, you have no sense of responsibility for maintaining them for the next generation. And a sense of gratitude, this is not to say everything's great and everything's perfect. There's plenty of room for more improvement. But, patriotism properly understood is very different, I would argue, from nationalism. Nationalism is angry, it's sort of tribal. Patriotism in the American context, which is different. Patriotism is open-hearted, it is creedal, and having a certain amount of gratitude for these things, which I have to say, Barack Obama was much better at talking about than conservatives gave him credit for. That has to be part of the solution. It can't be the whole of the solution, but rhetoric matters a lot. And if you teach people from the earliest age that the opposite of gratitude, which is entitlement and resentment, it's going to yield a certain kind of politics. It's also going to yield a certain kind of lifestyle. We've all known people who just always thought the world was out to screw them. They very rarely do really well in life, and they're certainly not particularly happy. And happiness is supposed to be part of why we do things.
By the way, I hate to keep quoting her, but she's pithy. My 5-year-old, I tell her over and over again to have an attitude of gratitude, and she says, "Nah, Mom, I got a batitude." And that's sort of where we are. One thing you talk about in the book is the idea of Rousseau's Romanticism, which I would quote in a more millennial way or paraphrase in a more millennial way as "my feels matter the most of all," right? How much do my feels matter? How much should they matter? And how is that manifested on the right and the left?
Yeah, it's manifests in all sorts of ways, and a lot of it comes from popular culture, right? These are things that are upstream of politics. It also comes from our educational system, where, I highly, highly recommend Jonathan Haidt's new book, Coddling of the American Mind, about how we raise children and what it does to them when you protect them from any kind of scary thought or scary interaction. It's a very useful book. We've raised generations of kids now, and a lot of them are fine kids. I mean, lots of people will do just fine. I mean, any generalization is going to be a generalization. But we've raised generations of kids who are told that if they just simply feel like someone was mean to them, that's proof enough. And I grew up, there were these public service ads on Saturday morning television when I was a kid. The song goes, "You're the most important person in the whole wide world. It's you, and you hardly even know you." It's like, I mean, that kind of stuff makes me want to cut myself, right? We have overemphasized self-esteem. We've overemphasized the idea that that your perspective is all the evidence you need for a grievance. And it yields a certain kind of politics on both the left and the right, because both the left and the right ultimately are downstream of these larger cultural forces. And so one of the things that we get, which is a little off the romantic point, except for the fact that you've got to remember modern nationalism is, was originally understood as romantic nationalism, because it came out of this idea of grievance about the Enlightenment, about the French controlling too much of Germany, and it was this idea that if we just consult our own myths and our folklore and our passions, and we embrace our anger at these things, we will forge this new tribe of Germans or whatever. Romanticism explains a huge chunk of where we are today in all sorts of different ways. But one of the things you get is negative polarization. A huge number of people in America are Democrats because they hate Republicans, or they're Republicans because they hate Democrats. You know, I keep quoting this. My wife got my favorite New Yorker cartoon blown up and framed, and it has two dogs sitting at a bar in New York drinking martinis, and one dog says to the other, "You know, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail." And so we have this notion on aspects of both the right and the left of that, first of all, as long as you make the right people angry,
Right.
it's justified, right? And this is a product of this ends justify the means thinking that has pervaded so much of the right and left. And the problem is that when you say the ends justify the means, very quickly the means become the ends. And so you have lots of college kids who think being an obnoxious jackass is justified if it's politically incorrect. And that Donald Trump, his tweets may be offensive, but they really make the right people angry. Liberals' tears are delicious. It's worth doing it to own the libs. I'm all in favor of owning the libs, but I want to own the libs because it's like we're winning an argument.
Right.
And not just being jerks. And there is this, and you get it, and now, you know, both of us have spent an enormous amount of time talking about the corrosive effects of Trump on conservatism and the Republican Party. Democrats do not appreciate the degree to which Trump is corrupting and corroding the Democratic Party. He's in all their headspace. Right now, there's this invisible primary to be the person that Donald Trump hates the most. Because in an era of negative partisanship, that is anointing. If the other tribe hates you the most, you must be the leader of my tribe.
Yeah.
And so that was, I believe, the real point of Elizabeth Warren's DNA fiasco, was to troll Trump and get him to attack her. And it worked. The problem was her explanation had other problems.
Yeah.
But it's why Hillary Clinton says we can't be civil anymore. It's why Eric Holder says when they go low, we kick them. It's why Michael Avenatti, that he's sort of like Pigpen from the Charlie Brown cartoons, except it's a fog of Axe body spray, does all of the things that he does. And there is this primary competition to be obnoxious. And the danger for the Democrats, I was talking to David Axelrod about this on this podcast, is that in a 16-person collective steel cage match primary like we had in 2016, it's very easy to see a path for the most obnoxious person to get the nomination.
Jumping off of that, a lot of Trump supporters will say, look, this was the tactic of the left, and there was a cultural war on the left, and the right was just not bothering to fight, right? Mm-hmm. Now, many in this room will probably disagree with that estimation, but I'm voicing it from their point of view.
Yeah.
And now they're just mad because there's a guy fighting them just as hard. Is Trump a reaction to something that was really there? In that way, can he be an answer to tribalism, or is he just spinning everyone into their own tribes?
So he's absolutely a symptom of, other problems in the culture. I have zero problem with, not zero, but I think it's a perfectly defensible political and intellectual position to have a transactional approach to Donald Trump. If you say, look, he's getting the judges, he's getting the tax cuts, these are the things he's getting done, I would argue, as you know, there's a debate in our circles in Washington about how much of the stuff Trump is doing is being done despite him rather than because of him. I'm a big fan of Cocaine Mitch, but if you want to have this transactional thing, just look, the tweets, you know, the outbursts, the nativist stuff, you know, the tweeting like an escaped monkey from a cocaine study. This is just part of the price of getting judges on the bench, and we got to live with it. That I can live with, or at least I can have a conversation with you about. I mean, it's still, there's long-term damage being done to conservatism and the Republican brand and all that kind of stuff, but that is an intellectually and morally defensible position to have. The problem is, and there's a point I make in the book, we're not wired that way. We want to believe that our leaders are profoundly moral and good people. And part of the problem that you get is that, like I say all the time, there's no definition of good character that Donald Trump can clear. And if someone has one, you know, I'll buy you a bottle of scotch. And it enrages certain people because they want to believe that he is this really wonderful person. And the transactional person can say, okay, he's not wonderful, but he's a useful tool. The problem is that the pressures from the sort of right-wing, sort of the conservative entertainment industry, and from MAGA Nation is, no, you have to be all in. You can't criticize him. You have to embrace full spectrum Trumpitude. That's corrupting, because what happens when you do that is your definition of good gets bent to fit the man. And my whole view from the beginning of this was I wasn't going to lie. And you know, there were lots of things that I didn't like when Barack Obama did them. I don't want to all of a sudden say they're great when Donald Trump does them. And one of the problems that we have is over the last 30 years, as you know, it's ironic. We live in one of the most partisan moments ever, but our political parties are weaker than ever. And because of that, what has happened on both sides of the aisle is a lot of institutions, ones that we've been associated with, have sort of turned into de facto party organs without realizing it, right? The job of explaining issues to the public, of credentializing candidates, that was historically done by parties. Now it's done by places like National Review and the Weekly Standard and Fox News. You can go down a list. And so 2016 was this really interesting kind of stress test where a lot of people who I thought had the same jobs that you and I have, more or less, turned out that when push comes to shove, right, they wear lots of hats. They're a pundit, they're a writer, they're a book author, and they're sort of a party promoter. And it turned out that for some people, the one hat they wouldn't take off when push came to shove after he got the nomination was to be a party person. I'm not a party person. And so it was amazing to me in those early days, so many people would say things like, when the little light on the camera would go on, they would talk about what a passionate constitutionalist Donald Trump is. And then the little light on the camera would go off, and they would turn to me and say, I can't believe I have to defend this guy. And my argument is, you don't. Your job is to tell the truth, as you see it, right? And that's a problem on both sides, is that there are an enormous number of people who are expected to fall in line for the party, and that's a form of corruption too.
Yeah, as somebody who's libertarian leaning, has a long history of just not much caring for politicians or believing that they are basically good. My first vote ever was a very proud vote against one John Edwards because he struck me as a little squicky.
He was so pretty.
At 18. I'm interested in this because I don't actually have an answer formulated to this, but for you, because we both through the Bush era and the Obama era doing this kind of work, was the demand the same for Obama, for liberal, for instance, for liberal pundits? Do you have to love the man and love everything he does and be all on board?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think one of the reasons why the mainstream media doesn't understand why Donald Trump's attack on them works so well with Republicans is that, look, the mainstream media is biased. I could argue this. They're not the enemy of the people. I hate that rhetoric. But they're biased. They're overwhelmingly liberal. Every study shows this. Every content analysis shows this. They have other biases as well. I mean, there's a reason why, car crashes lead the nightly, or violence and murders lead local news every night, is because people are interested in that because of human nature. But you know, the head political writer for Saturday Night Live said that it was impossible to make fun of Barack Obama. It was like trying to climb sheer glass. There was just nothing that could be mocked. And big chunks of the mainstream media just were invested in him in a romantic sense. I mean, I've written about this. I got this idea from this guy, Ace of Spades, who now despises me. But he had this brilliant analysis of how the press covered Obama. And he called it the MacGuffinization of politics. In film, MacGuffin is a term for the thing the hero wants, right? The Maltese Falcon is the classic MacGuffin. The briefcase in Pulp Fiction, classic MacGuffin. Alfred Hitchcock used to say, it doesn't matter what the MacGuffin is. It just matters that you're invested in the hero and therefore you want the hero to get it. So for years, Barack Obama went around saying he was not a king. The Constitution simply would not allow him to do something like DACA. Just would not allow it. He can't do it. Said it like 28 times, video all over the place of it. And then he did it. And virtually no one in the mainstream media held him to account for it. Instead, they wrote, Republicans pounce, or they treated him like the hero who had gotten what he wanted. Yeah. And people who aren't invested in Barack Obama as a hero watched that kind of coverage and all sorts more coverage like that. And they feel like, well, these guys are just on a different team. You know, if you believe that what Barack Obama said was true yesterday, and then he does the exact opposite, isn't one of the first sort of journalism 101 things, particularly when it comes to the Constitution, to hold him to account for it and to make him explain it? Instead, it was a purely celebratory atmosphere about it. And so vast chunks of the mainstream media, first of all, they're biased, they're invested in Democrats, they socialize with Democrats. They follow certain cues and narratives that are fundamentally liberal. And I don't think, by any stretch, they're deliberately trying to deceive people, is that their instincts have them respond to certain stimuli in a certain way, and then they're victims of groupthink. And people who aren't part of that watch it, and they think it's like a friggin' conspiracy. And so then they hear Donald Trump say, the enemy of the people, these people are terrible. And the mainstream media is like desperate to live down to Donald Trump's expectations.
Seemingly, yes.
And so they keep making more mistakes that can only be explained as if it's a conspiracy. It's a very unhealthy process.
Let me ask you, before we go to audience questions, about the issue of elites and elitism. And you write in the book about, and the founders understood that there will be elites. But one of the great, I think one of the things that Trump is a reaction to or a symptom of is this sort of condescending treatment,
yeah.
includes media, of large parts of the country that they don't understand, perhaps a rural tribe versus an urban East Coast or LA tribe. How do we grapple with that? Because there's a real complaint there. Same with Brexit. There's a real complaint that these folks are not serving my needs, and there's a reason I'm going to this extreme to rebuke them.
Right. So in evolutionary psychology, there's a term called the coalition instinct. It's not quite the same thing as tribalism, but it's sort of analogous to it. People of some shared interest, whether in a prison yard or on a college campus or a high school or in business, naturally form coalitions with people with shared interests. And it's very easy to trick the coalition instinct in certain ways. This explains why party politics can be so weird. Well, we forgive people on our team for, I don't know, cruising malls to hit on teenage girls. But then we talk about how, you know, the other team is a bunch of degenerates. And because the internal logic is all about, it's the unit, right? It's a cult of unity kind of mindset. This is part of human nature. It's been around forever. So one of the points I make in the book is that there have always been aristocracies, at least after the agricultural revolution. You start getting division of labor and specialization. And originally aristocracy, according to the Greek, was just meant rule of the best, the most qualified. But the coalition instinct kicks in, also the instinct that says protect your progeny, protect your bloodlines, which is found in every society in all of human history. And they redefine aristocracy to mean noble blood. And this way you protect not only your rights and privileges, you make this argument that for all time, your descendants deserve to rule simply by accident of birth. And this is one of the reasons why I despise identity politics, because one of the beautiful and glorious things about the American experience is that at least the ideal is you're supposed to take people as you find them, not say that some people are better or worse or more deserving simply by accident of their birth. That's why the Founding Fathers got rid of titles and nobility. The problem is the coalition instinct is a permanent feature of human life. Adam Smith writes in The Wealth of Nations that seldom will men of the same trade or business meet in a pub or a tavern where the conversation won't quickly turn to a conspiracy against the public good. And what he's saying there is that people want to form monopolies, right? They want to form cartels. And Smith says this is completely natural and you can't get rid of it if you wanted to. But what you can do is prevent the government from sanctioning certain cartels and giving them power that they don't have. Those cartels in the Federalist Papers are called factions. And the whole point of our system is to keep one faction from taking over the power of government and imposing its views on everybody else. The populist critique from both the Bernie Sanders crowd and the Trump crowd of the globalists or the establishment, some of it is perfectly justified, some of it isn't. But there is a sense in which elites, people who benefit the most from this system, are writing the rules to benefit themselves. And one of the things I always try to tell kids who are interested in policy stuff, complexity is a subsidy. The more complex you make society, the more red tape that you create, the more hurdles that you lay down for people to jump, the more you are subsidizing people who are rich, who have high levels of social capital or connections, people who have lots of lawyers, and it's basically a building of a moat around, or a wall that's a barrier to entry for people. And so one of the ways I think you solve it is just simple rules for a complex society.
Right. I'm going to, on that note, move us to questions because I want to make sure we get plenty. Students first 3 questions.
Hi, my name's Ananth. I'm a 4th year. So you're talking about how media companies, for the sake of making money, give people what they want, and people follow politics like sports. Do you think this could be fixed by sort of reinstituting the Fair News Act, or it's just a monetary incentive and they're going to keep harming the country for the sake of making money?
First of all, I don't think money is the sole driver of it, right? Many people are much more desirous of seeking status than money. And they think the money is in recognition of their status rather than the other way around. But I don't think the fairness doctrine was a good idea. I don't think it's particularly enforceable in this media climate. It's one thing when you had 5, 6 major news outlets that dominated the entire landscape. How you do the fairness doctrine for the internet, right? This is another one of these complexity is a subsidy thing. There are lots of journalists who want journalists to have licenses, which I think is outrageous. We all have a right to commit journalism. Free speech is a right that is endowed in every citizen, not some guild that happens to have the right ring or chain from the Meisters at the Columbia Journalism School. But one of the things that we could, as a cultural thing, avoid is, like I haven't been there yet, but I've been told that at the Washington Post, in their new newsroom, they got giant monitors on all the walls, huge things, sort of like in the movie War Games, and it's a live clock of clicks and page views that they're getting. And so everybody in the room is seeing who is being the most read. So you have Jen Rubin writing how, there's her 900th piece on how Trump is Hitler, and it's going through the roof, and meanwhile somebody else has just written an amazing story about children dying of starvation in Yemen, and it's like click, click, right? That sets a culture where everybody is looking to be the front of the pack, and I think it is incredibly unhealthy. But you'll get better politics and better media when we have better citizens, and people don't take their citizenship very seriously in this country, and that's the demand side that needs to be fixed as well.
So you kind of talked a lot about hypocrisy, both on the part of politicians and commentators who seem to shift their values based on what policy coalition is, being discussed, which seems really like an obvious point when you argue it. Why do you think it is, based on your experience, that they don't see it that way?
Why don't they see that they're hypocrites?
We try to tell them.
I grab them by the lapel and shake them. Because the human capacity to rationalize one's own position is really one of the more remarkable things about our species. And it gets partly to this coalition instinct thing, where we hold up the worst example of the other tribe and say this is indicative and representative of all of those people. And that we take the worst examples of our own tribe and say, well, that's really an exception to the rule, or you're being unfair. And the capacity for people to have cognitive dissonance about these things is really kind of amazing. And, Mary Catherine began by talking about being sort of politically and ideologically homeless. The real trick is I feel politically homeless. Yeah. I feel more ideologically secure than I've ever been, because I kind of feel like I've been taken outside of my tribe, and I get to put on my sort of sociologist glasses, and I look at my own side in ways that I haven't in the past. And it's very kind of intellectually liberating. It can also make you kind of a condescending prick to your own team, and I try to avoid that. But I'm much more, I feel like I'm watching politics as an observer rather than a participant, because I just don't have the emotional investment in a lot of the team tribal stuff. I like the ideas, I like the arguments, but I try very hard not to get too invested in this idea that the other side are bad people and my side are good people. That's just a dangerous way to think.
There's also great utility in being the person who says, like, well, there was President Obama. He was on one side, didn't much care for many of his policies, and was honest about it. Now here's this guy. He's supposed to be my side. Don't much care for him and many of his policies. There's a sort of fairness in that, and I think it's helpful.
Yeah, but also, it's a weird thing for people like us to be essentially centrists.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, my ideological positions haven't changed. It's that the political compass has moved in a way that if you're willing to praise Donald Trump or the Trump administration when that does good things, but also say that Democrats have a point when they criticize Donald Trump about other things, it pleases nobody, Although I think it pleases a lot of people, but they're not the ones who are fully engaged in politics. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm a second year in the college from Iowa City, Iowa. And I had an interesting experience in the last election, which was that I was canvassing before the caucus for Bernie Sanders, who was not very well known. And they would send us to Republican houses, and actually I would have a lot of interesting discussions with people about his policy proposals, and sometimes I'd get called naive, but that was about the worst of it. Mm-hmm. Then later, canvassing for the Clinton campaign, people would come up to me on the street and say, never forget Benghazi, and then strings of expletives. So how can someone like me react to that once this machine has built up hatred?
Well, look, so Hillary Clinton is a special case, right? And this is a point that I try to explain to a lot of people. Donald Trump only had 2 mandates in terms of conservative or Republican voters. The first one was Donald Trump's impassioned promise that he would not be Hillary Clinton. And he fulfilled that promise on day one. The other was to appoint conservative judges. But because of this negative polarization stuff, Hillary Clinton had become a symbol more than anybody else. I'm not a fan. People keep saying, in 2016, they keep yelling at me, it's a binary choice. It's a binary choice, right? I was like, yeah, it's a choice between 2 crap sandwiches on different kinds of bread. I'm not going there. But she became kind of like, a Medusa head for a lot of conservatives. You reach into the sack and you petrify your enemies with it, right? And it was very effective for Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders doesn't play that role. There's something avuncular and all that kind of stuff about him. So I think I I'm not usually the guy you go to for advice to how to canvass better for Bernie Sanders. But I would simply say that if the person is freaking out about the personality, talk about the ideas, or just move on to somebody better.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Brandon. I'm a student in the college, and I'm working on a paper on populism in Poland. So listening to your talk, I was wondering what tenets of nationalism and populism would you say are transferred to the European case with the rise of nationalism there? And then also, how does this affect liberal world order and how the US has all these internal problems with populism and how that affects its place in the global sphere?
Yeah, so, the question that we had earlier about elites and their role, and I talked about the complexities of subsidy and all that kind of stuff. One of the reasons why you have so much populism in Europe is the unbelievably haughty and condescending way the EU leadership treated their own peoples. And this goes back 30 years. I remember in the 1990s, you'd look at polls and the death penalty was still popular throughout most of Europe. I mean, very popular. EU, Eurocrats, whether they were formally in the EU structure or just sort of from that stripe, they just got rid of it without any democratic, authority because they didn't like it. And you see that kind of stuff all over the place in Europe, which breeds this populist backlash. It's interesting, among the big industrial democracies, the one country that doesn't have big populism problems is Japan. Because Japan also doesn't have lots of immigration. And there's an enormous amount of literature. I mean, Robert Putnam has done fantastic stuff on this, that it's really immigration more than anything else that drives a lot of populism. And it's not necessarily racist. Some of it is, obviously. But you go back and you look at the 19th and 18th centuries in the United States, immigration drove, watch Gangs of New York. It's all white dudes from basically the same island in Europe killing each other. What happens is that if you have a settled community with shared norms and expectations about what community standards are, and then you just bring in people who are different, not saying bad, just different, it causes people to sort of retreat from civil society, to hunker down, to go to Facebook where they have their worst instincts confirmed rather than challenged. And Putnam found that that increasing diversity through immigration was actually corrosive to a lot of civil society. Again, he didn't blame racism primarily on it. I think that in Europe, it's a particularly bigger problem. Europe is much worse at assimilating immigrants than the United States is, always has been. And the immigrant countries, the immigrant populations that are coming in are also are much more resistant to being assimilated. We take largely a whole bunch of Catholic people from South America. The transition is just not that big a deal compared to coming from Muslim countries. And so I don't like populism. I think populism is inherently anti-intellectual. It's not, there's a reason why populism and democracy are different words, because they describe different things. Populism, I believe, is a form of identity politics. My favorite line comes from William Jennings Bryan, where he says, "The people of Nebraska are for free silver, therefore I'm for free silver. I will look up the arguments later." I like arguments. I think they're essential to a democracy. But populism arises for legitimate reasons. And it's a signal, it's a die marker that tells you something's going wrong. And if you look at the Brexit vote, the most passionate pro-Brexit people were people who were saying they felt like their country was being taken away from them. And that is a perfectly legitimate feeling. You can't just, and if you have the response that the New York Times and EU types and say anyone who feels that way is just a xenophobe or a bigot, you make the problem worse. And so it takes a certain amount of political empathy for people who you disagree with on policy to understand that, like, they like their country the way it is, and they love and they want to conserve it, right, out of a sense of gratitude or whatever. And I like immigration, but you have to account for people who feel that way. And politics all around the world where we've had large levels of immigration hasn't been doing that, and that's why you have these populist backlashes.
Hey,
Thanks for being with us today. My name is Jalal Yunus. I'm a first-year graduate student at the Harris School of Public Policy. So in the second half of the talk, you mentioned that you think it's an intellectually and morally defensible position that to view the Trump presidency as purely transactional. Whereas earlier in the talk, you mentioned the problem with the ends justifying the means as a philosophical idea is that the means quickly become the ends. So I'm wondering how you reconcile those two positions. And I mean, I'm not asking to impress any law school admissions officers. I'm asking because I'm wondering if that's a way to look at, like, how do we look at the Trump presidency in light of the damage potentially to the norms? Is it reasonable to take that position where we justify it in light of the federal judgeships and so forth?
Yeah, so I'm talking about arguments I'm having intramurally on the right, where there are a lot of conservatives for whom Trump was never their cup of tea, right? I mean, one of the things that I think really bothers me about the way a lot of people in sort of our group is they don't take enough credit for the things that Trump does right. Take the specific issues of the Kavanaugh nomination and put them aside. The reason why Donald Trump picked Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and used that list is not because Sean Hannity made him, right? It is not because the MAGA hat crowd demanded it from him. The people who demanded it from him were the people who were skeptical of Trump, who were like, I just don't feel I can trust this guy. And we allow that conversation to go ass backwards after these nomination fights where Trump's biggest supporters, who would celebrate him if he appointed Gene Pirro to the court, say, see, this proves that he is a committed, passionate, strict constructionist. No, it doesn't. It proves that on some issues you can actually force him to toe an ideological line that he doesn't believe. Donald Trump, his only relationship to any abortion bill prior to being elected president was to pay one. He was pro-choice almost his entire life, right? So he was very sort of liberal on guns, on immigration issues. In 2012, he attacked Mitt Romney for being too harsh on immigration. Mitt Romney. And he understood, for good or bad, that he had to flip-flop on those things. He had to flip-flop. That's the transaction part that I think people aren't appreciating enough. If it's the pure cult of personality thing, then you'll forgive him whatever he does. And so, look, I think as a cost-benefit analysis, the transactional approach has deep problems, has deep moral problems. Because with it, as I was trying to suggest, it comes with this incredible pressure to lie and to bend your principles to fit the man. But at least the people who make the transactional argument aren't lying. They aren't saying that Comrade Trump will deliver the greatest wheat harvests we've ever seen east of the Urals, right? They're saying, look, yeah, he's a problem. Yeah, I don't like all this stuff, but these are the things I want to get out of it. Let's make the best of a bad situation, because simply violating democratic norms isn't going to get him impeached. And so you have one president at a time, let's deal with it. That's an argument a conversation I can have with somebody. I can't have a conversation with somebody who in 2016 was lying to support Donald Trump and now completely believes the lies. And that's another form of corruption. And so one of the things that gives me hope is that if you look at the polling of young, self-identified conservatives, they very much want Donald Trump to be primaried in 2020. And I don't think that's going to lead to much or anything like that. But what it points to is the fact that young people still live in a society where they actually have to defend their principles to people who disagree with them. Part of the problem with the big sort is that people 65 and over who watch Fox News all day, and I'm a Fox News contributor, full disclosure, who watch Fox News all day, they've been through all these fights. They don't know anybody who disagrees with them as a statistical matter, and they want Trump to be president for life. But young people who actually care more about defending the ideas for the long term, they understand the problem that Trump presents, and they want to find some alternative to it. And that is a good thing. But I just don't like enthusiasm. I've never liked I don't like going to rock concerts because people all into something make me nervous, right? I don't like populism. I don't like crowds. I know because I can tell a joke better than most conservatives, which is a really low bar, right? I mean, it's like the best gas station sushi in Alabama. People think that I'm this man. My misanthropy is strong, right? And so one of the things I like about the founding is this idea that it constrains enthusiasm, it tempers enthusiasm. And what bothers me about the cult of personality for Trump, which is what bothered me about the cult of personality for Obama, is the enthusiasm of it. It's the willingness to bend all of your pre-existing arguments and principles to fit the man. And that, to me, is a kind of corruption.
Hi, Mr. Goldberg. I'm a first-year student at the college. So over the past 2 years, I've come to see, the Republican Party go in a direction I don't like, and the Democratic Party go in a direction I don't like. And I've begun to feel, as you said, it's not ideologically moored as much as politically moored. But when you do feel that way, I guess a sense of despair comes. And in that despair, I look for hope. So where do I find the hope going forward, and where can I reconcile this severe negativity in politics, and when will positivity come back?
Sure. So first of all, there's a reason why first of all, day drinking helps. Second of all, there's a reason why I call my podcast The Remnant, because it's this idea going back to Albert J. Nock, and then before that to the book of Isaiah, about sort of being left behind in the times. And so this is just something that's going to be part of your life for a little while. I would also say that, look, one of the reasons why I'm a conservative is that I think politics is supposed to be about a very small slice of your life. You're not supposed to get a sense of meaning and belonging and love from the government in Washington. You're supposed to get it from faith, family, friends, community, and those kinds of places. And that's why I've always been a sort of the kind of conservative I am, is because I passionately believe the government cannot love you. And so, it's like Michael Oakeshott, one of the great, British conservative philosophers, he says, there is nothing inherent in conservatism that says you can't be a radical in other spheres of your life than politics. I'm not sure I completely agree with that, because there are different definitions of conservatism, but it's a good way to think about it sometimes. So there's that. I'll also say, Herb Stein, who used to be the head of the economics department at AEI, coined Stein's law. And Stein's law holds that anything that cannot go on forever must eventually stop. And so far it checks out. And so, look, we live in a moment where, because of negative polarization, you have so many people who are Democrats because they hate Republicans and vice versa. Well, it is entirely conceivable that if one party dies, the other party loses its reason to live. And you could see a radical, they still be called Democrats and Republicans, but the coalitions they appeal to could be remarkably different than the ones we have today. I don't think third parties is the way to go, but there's reason to believe that politics eventually will be more responsive to what Americans really want from it. The biggest single party in this America are the people who aren't Republicans or Democrats these days. And political markets tend to respond to that kind of thing. So I would not, and lastly, which I sign in a lot of people's books, is despair is a sin, so you shouldn't do it.
Got time for two more.
So earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that you mentioned the EU's unilateral action on the death penalty. And you were criticizing that. But later on in the conversation, you brought up William Bryan's funny quote about, the people of Nebraska support free silver, so I support free silver. And so I guess, that's a contradiction that a lot of Americans are facing. Should the government do what the people want, or should the government lead from ahead? And I guess, what bargain would you strike?
Yeah, so I'm against all forms of philosophical, political, epistemological monism, right? I don't believe that you can reduce everything down to a single variable or question. A big part of what conservatism is about is recognizing that there are trade-offs to everything, that every good decision has a bad side to it, that you're foregoing doing something else to govern is to choose, is the argument, right? And I think this applies to these kinds of questions too. Like, if you are morally just wildly opposed to the death penalty, I completely understand why you would do politics as the crow flies, as like Michael Oakeshott put it. Take the shortest distance you can to get to the policy end that you want, right? This is an argument that a lot of pro-lifers have. It's like, we don't care that we're using the courts, we don't care whatever. Abortion is evil, we got to get rid of it, right? It's the same thing with the anti-death penalty crowd. The problem with those kinds of approaches, which can be defended on moral grounds, whichever, that's a different issue. On political grounds, the problem with that, and this is something that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has conceded, is that when the courts short-circuited the argument about abortion through Roe v. Wade, they took the issue out of the hands of people who were arguing about it close to the ground. And the country was getting remarkably close to coming up with some kind of compromise position on abortion, which many people may not like, but instead it imposed this abortion regime that is much more permissive than a lot of the talking points will tell you. And it created a pro-life movement that probably never would have existed. And so sometimes the process is really important to confer democratic legitimacy and buy-in from the people. And if you impose things, even if you take it as a stipulation, death penalty is absolutely evil, it might be worth enduring the existence of the death penalty for another decade while you make the arguments and you get the people to buy into the policy decision, because that's the way you have lasting commitment to it. And that's a prudential question. There is no hard and fast rule. If the government found out tomorrow that some kind of soda was poisonous, I don't think they have to put it up for a vote to get it off the market, right? You have to make these questions, but there are other things that you actually do have to have a democratic debate about. I promise the last one will be very quick.
One more.
All right. Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Goldberg. My name is Brett. I'm a fourth year in the college. My question is, in these times of political shift, are you encouraged by those on the left's newfound appreciation for federalism and the 10th Amendment?
I welcome it. I wrote a column very early in the Trump administration saying that I'm going to forego pointing out all of their hypocrisy and denouncing them for their inconsistency on this issue. Instead, I want to encourage buy-in, right? Because when Republicans are in office and people talk about the 9th and 10th Amendment and federalism, the immediate response is, that's unpatriotic. You want to secede? You're, with one nation politics, blah, 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 blah. And then Democrats come into office and all of a sudden, isn't it great? California's talking about seceding. We didn't talk about it much here, but I truly and passionately believe that one of the best and most promising solutions to our problems is to push as much power down to the most local level possible. If you give people at the local level more control over their lives, they will feel less like unseen forces far away are controlling their lives. In politics, if you push power down to the most local level possible, you'll still have culture war fights, but the winners will have to look the losers in the eye the next day at the kids' school track meet or at the supermarket, which breeds a certain sense of empathy and humility. You'll also know who to fire if you send this stuff down to the most local level, because the powers that be will have faces and names to them. And we are wired to want to actually live with real human beings. And so if you give people responsibility to run their own lives, it means, yes, some places will be the kind of stuff that will drive the crowd on Fox and Friends nuts. And some places will be the kind of crowd that drives the crowd on Morning Joe nuts. That's okay. There's a right to live the way you want to live, and federalism, rightly understood, is the best system ever conceived of for maximizing human happiness insofar as it lets more people live the way they want to live. And instead what we get is this tribal system where people get all torqued up because somebody who lives 3,000 miles away is living wrong. That's a nutty way to run a country. And so it's like the truck that gets stuck in the tunnel. The way you get it out is letting the air out of the tires. Shrink the issue, send this stuff back to the local level. And that means that left-wingers who want to live, want to run hemp farms on communes, fine. But it also means that the crowd from Footloose gets to sort of ban rock music. So be it. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. It will make, at minimum, this country a lot more interesting place to drive across.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Read the book. Learn stuff. Thank you, John.